as we leave the tombs of quarantine, a return to normal would be a disaster unless we recognize that the world that we are going back to is in desperate need of healing. And for me, the source of healing is an empty tomb in Jerusalem. Dr. Esau McCaulley penned that on Easter Sunday in the New York Times, in this moment that we find ourselves in where we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, as some of us have said, things beginning maybe to open up. And yet at the same time, we are keenly aware that the world around us is still there's so much hurt and so much brokenness around it. We are in this moment where we've seen new tensions that COVID has created. We've seen in our slowdown the amplification of other tensions that maybe we've never really paid attention to before until our lives slowed down. We've seen and confronted the need for reforms and accountability. We've seen systems and structures of injustice perpetuate. We've maybe even seen some unhealthy patterns in us, that the rush to get back to baseball games and out to eat and on vacation and to see family, or even to come together as a church, though those things are not in and of themselves bad things, could distract us from that reality, that the reality that the world around us is in such desperate need to see and to experience a life beyond this normal. And for the early church in the book of Acts, the resurrection of Jesus wasn't just this neat thing to put in their pocket or their fanny pack and then go back to their work or back to their families or back to their sporting events, that it was a paradigm shift that transformed how people who encountered this resurrection thought about themselves, thought about their pursuit of community, and even how they thought about their city. It was a beyond normal. And so what we've done these past few weeks is asked ourselves this question: is what if there's a better question than how quickly can we get back to normal, but how rather can we think beyond what's normal and really live into this moment with the strategy and passion that the Spirit of God moving and dwelling in us would provide. And today we're going to take a look in Acts 16 at a moment and a place in a city that's dealing with some hurts of their own, that's dealing with the pressures of being successful in business, that's dealing with exploitation and injustice, that will see systems and structures that mistreat citizens in the city called Philippi. And as we look at Acts 16, verse 40, we see this great summary kind of statement. We see this idea, of their church and what the church in Philippi looked like, described as this. After Paul and Silas came out of prison, they went to Lydia's house where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left. Right? This moment of encouragement, this brief transitional statement actually represents a multi-ethnic, multi-economic, multi-generational community of people living out the mission of God in their time as Jews and Gentiles, as civil servants, as former slaves, as successful CEOs, as men and women, Jew and Gentile, coming together to live out a picture of hope that's beyond normal life in Philippi. And if we want to be people of healing, we can learn some things by looking at Acts chapter 16 and seeing the origin and the rhythms that this community employed to bring that kind of encouragement and thriving both to one another and to their city. We can see first that this is a Spirit-led community. Then if we want to be a group of people, a collective mission at the Foundry that is a place of healing and hope for our moment, that we've got to connect back to the Spirit of God moving and dwelling in us, that the reality that the tomb is empty and the Spirit of God has filled the heart and the life and the rhythms of us as believers and followers of Jesus. My temptation when I look at a text like Acts 16 or someone describes to me the Philippian church is to want to write down all of the practical strategies and tips. Maybe I can go to a conference. Maybe I can set up a Zoom call with someone on their executive team. But the birth, the origin of this thriving community that's a place of healing in a difficult city and time is actually a group of people who are being led and moved by the Spirit of God to be present and on mission there. If you look at Acts chapter 16, verse 6, we'll see that Paul was actually doing preaching and teaching in a way that was trying to move him eastward, was trying to move him into Asia. And despite the fact that there's skill and there's talents and there's ability in that crowd, Luke was telling us here, who's the historian who's writing the account, hey, they just were coming up against closed doors. It was not happening for them. And then in verse 8 and 9, we're told that one night Paul has a dream of a man from Macedonia, which is the region where Philippi is, standing and begging him, come over to Macedonia and help us. Verse 10, after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. And verses 12 tells us essentially that they end up in Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city in the district of Macedonia, and they stayed there for several days. This is a spirit-led movement toward Philippi, and in the initial days and moments of being present there. This is not birthed out of some grandiose strategy or structure or 300-point plan, but when Paul and the community of people that are following and working with him respond to the invitation of the Spirit to be present. It's not that there's not strategy. It's not that there's not rhythms of incarnation, but those things are framed by and formed by the where and when of God's Spirit working and moving, right? God was calling them not to Asia at that time, but to this particular city, working through the vision that Paul has. And this is so important, I think, for us to understand on kind of two levels, right? The first being that I know for a lot of us right now, we maybe feel like Paul, right? We feel stuck by all of the pivots and all the things we've been frustrated with this past year, the things we haven't been able to do, the things we haven't been able to get to. And it's maybe a challenge for us to ask this question, but it's important. God, where, if the answer is not the things that you don't want us to do, God, where are you inviting us to work? Where are you inviting us to be present? Whether it's in this city or in a particular rhythm with a particular family, with a particular person that maybe God has put on our heart. And I'll just think on another level too, this is important for us to consider, because if Paul's anything like me, I know that when I reach closed doors, when things don't go to my plan, when they don't go to my strategy, I become a bit of a control freak. I don't like not knowing what's going to happen next. I don't like knowing how the plan's not, come. I don't like the plan not coming together. And so for me, a lot of times, words like love and justice and peace and mercy, gentleness, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, these words that are in different ways sort of anchored in the framework of what it means to follow Jesus, that for me, those things become corrupted by fatigue and frustration. Right? My picture of justice right now, like yours, can be so corrupted by the bombardment of just news story after news story after news story where weariness begins to set in. And if I'm honest, there are times where I find myself getting angry in disproportionate ways. Or there's other times when I find myself just so numb from all of the other ways I've had to be angry that I can't find the anger in me, because I'm angered out, I'm cried out. And what coming back to being Spirit-led does is it centers us both in the characters and qualities of Jesus, right? Not the behavior modification, but the presence of God living and working in our lives, centering praise prayer, is finding time throughout the day, in the morning, in the evening, multiple times, reflecting on a passage, whatever that might look like for you in terms of getting started or keeping the ball rolling, is an opportunity for us not just to present a laundry list of demands to God, but to center ourselves in where the mission of God and the inputs that will create the right outputs might be taking root in us. And so where can you begin to find that kind of start? Where can you begin to find that kind of space in the next 7 days so that you can process those frustrations and the pivots of this moment appropriately, so that you can carry appropriately the heaviness of our moment as we aim to step into the places that need healing and need to experience healing? But what happens there is not just a posture of prayer. That's the foundation. What happens next is Paul shows up. And so that's not just arrival in Philippi, but there's two moments that Luke's going to tell us about, both of which coincidentally, in connection to this first idea I shared with you, are happening in the context of times when Paul's looking for the organization of a prayer meeting. He's looking for an opportunity to gather, but he's being asked to show up and to be present in another way. The first one of these takes place in verse 13, when he's looking out on the Sabbath day, looking for a place of prayer. He sits down and begins to speak to women who are gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us into her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. So here's Paul looking for a prayer meeting, looking to do that very thing we just said. And here in this moment, he ends up having a conversation with a successful CEO of a woman who is religious. She's not Jewish, but she's eager to learn about the Hebrew scriptures. She reads them, and we would love her in Baltimore because she is a dealer in purple cloth, which means she doesn't just make Ravens jerseys, but like she bakes like what is at that time luxury, the best of the best. She is making luxurious items, and she's done very well for herself. And here in this moment, as Paul's looking for a place of prayer, he begins to have a conversation where he's being invited by the Spirit to show up and contextualize the things that she knows with the story that he's encountered. And that leads to Lydia and her household making the decision to follow Jesus, and ultimately Paul having now a gathering place, probably for that very prayer meeting that he was aiming to set up. It's a great moment for us as we consider how to be a people of healing and a place of healing in our time, that as we're going to the grocery store, as we're going to get our takeout meal, as we're stepping into the pickup line, as we're jumping on our 400th Zoom call for the day, as we're making a phone call to someone who is vulnerable, we are carrying with us the opportunity to be present and near places where maybe in this case, rational conversation just needs to take place about how someone could follow Jesus. That's what it was for Lydia. But also just how do we contextualize the pressures that we're facing? Lydia has a unique set of pressures as someone who owns her own business and is dealing in purple cloth that the gospel speaks to when Paul shows up. There's a second selection here that Luke gives us that couldn't be more different. Again, Paul's looking for a place of prayer in verse 16, but he walks past a female slave who has a spirit by which she predicts the future. And so she's demon possessed, and the text tells us that she's earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. So someone is exploiting her in this process. So they're utilizing her her oppression in this case to profit themselves. Verse 17 tells us that she followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the ways to be saved." And she kept this up for several days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the Spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." And at that moment, the Spirit left her. Okay, this couldn't be more different than the account that we were just given. This is not a CEO. This is actually a person that Paul's walking past every day that's annoying. And she's not saying anything obtuse, actually. She's saying, this guy's the servant of the Most High God. And as he's walking past and perhaps a little bit annoyed by that, it comes to the realization that there's more to the story, that she's demon possessed, that there's someone making money off of that possession. And as he subjects himself in that rhythm of that encounter to what's going on, he provides deliverance. And I think this is really a good encouragement for us who want to be healing people in the city, right? Does anything about living in a city annoy you? Anything at all, right? Of course. Like, let's be real. There's problems that you try to avoid or dodge. There's maybe intersections that you don't drive past because you just don't want to deal with whatever's there on that corner. There's parts of the city that maybe people even in leadership would like to pretend like that's not something that goes on here. And one of the ways in which Paul brings healing in this situation is in a willingness to show up in something that's difficult, exploitive, and honestly kind of annoying to him. Both the annoyance of maybe her following him, but seeing the injustice of what's happening and what's going on. And I think this is a good encouragement for us as we aim to, in both of these contexts, to be people of prayer. We see some of the transformation happen in this space by a willingness to enter spaces where we can have dialogue with people who are hungry for dialogue, and where we can begin to lean in and disrupt the status quo, the systems and structures of things that for those of us who maybe aren't followers of Jesus, we just try to avoid because they just annoy us. And Paul's annoyance is moved to action. Where can you begin to be present this week? Where can you begin to show up? Through the walls of your house, through the Zoom screen, in a particular area of rhythm in and around our city. The call for us is to show up, but not just to show up, to suffer and to sacrifice. You've heard the phrase, "no good deed goes unpunished." And rather than applaud Paul for disrupting the oppression that's going on here, it's been quite normalized in Philippi. So normalized, in fact, that the people who were making money off of this young woman, rather than applaud and go, "Hey, you healed her, that was great," they actually go and have Paul and Silas seized. They have them brought before magistrates. The crowd of people in the city begin to beat him. And so Paul and Silas find themselves stripped, beaten, flogged, and actually thrown in jail. And when they get to jail, verse 24 tells us that the jailer he doesn't ask the question of Paul's citizenship status, which would actually give him a better deal, and doesn't bind his wounds, which is something else that he should do in this situation, just locks him up, tortures him further. That's the reward for showing up and doing the thing God called Paul and Silas to do. And even in this moment, transformation is happening. Let me tell you how it happens. Verse 25 tells us that rather than living into bitterness and frustration, though certainly Paul and Silas have got to be angry, they've got to be bitter, they've got to be frustrated, they've got to be confused, right? Remember you told us to come to Philippi, God. You told us to come here, and this is the reward for freeing somebody who's possessed. This is the reward for doing a good thing. Look at what happens in verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he knew he drew his sword because he was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. And Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourselves. We are here." Two things I want to point out to you is that, first of all, Paul and Silas's stewardship of the suffering they were going in and through in that moment had a ripple effect to other prisoners. Other people who were prisoners and suffering were able to look at them and see the hope that they had and draw strength and endurance and want to see a life modeled after that thing. But it also impacts the retired soldier turned jailer, civil servant who's probably not interested in religious dialogue like Lydia, probably not interested in even what got Paul and Silas thrown there to begin with, the issue of the injustice. Hey, buddy, everyone's got a story when they come into this jail. Don't tell me how innocent you are. When the earthquake shakes these gates open and it appears as if maybe the get out of jail free card has been offered to Paul and Silas, they live in a way that helps the jailer understand the hope that they have in Jesus. They stay put. He gives his life to Jesus. His household is baptized. And when Paul and Silas are released, this jailer becomes part of this early community in Philippi. And what's so interesting to me is that this jailer, the verse 33 tells us this, if you look at 31 through 39, that this jailer who did not bind their wounds, who did not take care of them in the right way, did not ask if they were Roman citizens, though Paul was, that it begins to be something that where restoration begins to happen through how Paul and Silas suffer and sacrifice in this moment. You see, we all want to see systems and structures like bring flourishing and thriving, particularly through the lens of the gospel. But the reality is, some of the ways in which that's going to be carried out is in the ways in which we are dealing with living in a fallen world and dealing with the systems and structures that are fallen. That it's not enough for us just to say, hey, there's bad things going on out there, stop it. But to walk into those things and to be part of the sacrifice required in dismantling those things. If we look at what happens in Acts 16, it's something I just never have noticed before, but it's pertinent in our moment that what Paul makes sure he gets to chance to say is to the magistrates and to the officials, hey, Roman citizen here, and I was mistreated by you. And it's an interesting moment where we see Paul sacrificing on an interpersonal level, but also on an institutional level. Robert Linthicum wrote a book in 1957 called City of God, City of Satan. He talked about, and in it, he talks about being a young minister in an urban context where a 14-year-old girl named Ava comes to his church and then ultimately to this Bible study. And as she arrives at this Bible study, she shares her life, that she's going to a school that is underperforming, that she's not learning anything, her reading and arithmetic and writing, it's just not good, that her family, there's a lot of brokenness there, that she lives in a place where crime and drugs and brokenness is pervasive. But through the opportunities of this church and the work of this young minister, comes to a place where she embraces the gospel and continues to walk in and come to this study. And one night she gets vulnerable. She asks this question. She says, hey, excuse me, Pastor, There's a gang in my neighborhood that's trying to recruit me because there's a prostitution thing kind of happening here where people come in from the suburbs and then leave and they try to recruit young women to be part of it. What am I going to do? And he talks about, Robert Linthicum does, giving her the advice that she needed to pray, read the Bible, and resist temptation. and that the girl ultimately just walked away sad, and ultimately did not come back. And he tracked her down a couple of weeks later, where she immediately saw him and grew defensive. And she said, listen, I had to, okay? Inferring that she had in fact joined the work of the gang, that she had found herself now in a place where she was, as a young woman, prostituting, and said basically, they beat my dad, they beat my brother, they've threatened my family. This is what I have to do. And Robert Linthicum said, why didn't you just call the police? And she said, don't you know that they're in on it too? And it was this moment where Robert Linthicum realized, as he wrote in this book, that in 1957, that working very, very hard to help individuals recognize and accept salvation was a very important and noble work. But if he was going to create a movement of discipleship in a city, he also had to work and sacrifice on the institutions and the structures that were also robbing people made in the image of God and flourishing. That he had to address the gospel, not just on the individual level, but also at how it dismantles the systems and structures. And that happens when followers of Jesus are willing to show up, yes, but also to sacrifice and suffer in difficult situations, and then ultimately come to a place where they're sharing. So as this jailer becomes a follower of Jesus because of the suffering and the sacrifice of Paul, we get this last line in Acts chapter 16, verse 40, where we see this group of followers of Jesus at Lydia's house, meeting together with brothers and sisters, being encouraged. What we see here in this moment are followers of Jesus, young children in the case of the slave girl, successful CEO businesswomen in the case of Lydia, a civil servant who's got a good job upholding Roman law, but now is doing it differently in terms of the jailer, coming together, striving to live into the Spirit of God, but yielding their gifts, their passions, their story to the way of God. Philippians chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, Paul will reflect on this later on to talk about how this Philippian church had a partnership in the gospel, that they didn't just see the work and the movement that would happen in their city as something that was for Paul and Silas to do. Because Paul and Silas, as the verse shows us, are going to leave. But they buy in, they see that, as Ephesians 2:10 says, that they are God's workmanship. That is 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 10 speaks to, that they are people that are using the gifts that they have to serve others, to be faithful stewards of God's grace. That the movement that shapes here in Philippi is not just the movement of the charismatic capabilities of one or two Christian celebrities, but every follower of Jesus who's been freed to live into that gospel hope, sharing what they have in terms of gifts, passions, and story, to live for a greater hope than their own. Said differently by Charles Haddon Spurgeon, every Christian is a missionary or an imposter. And it's a provocative and important question for us to think about, but I'll offer it. If everyone in our church served and gave and showed up like you, how healthy would our church be? And this is not to compound guilt. This is to offer invitation and to remind you that God wants to use you. God wants to use your gifts. God wants to use your passions. God wants to use your story to bring flourishing and healing in and beyond the walls of our church and our city. I think about one person in our church right now who is taking one of the worst moments of their life and being sentenced to prison, to not just being the place where he encountered Jesus, but now is working actively to be a source of hope for those who are leaving prison, and to be a source of hope and healing where the systems and structures in our state are disruptive to the opportunities for people to avoid reoffense. I think about another person right now who's just gotten so passionate about the crisis of addiction in our community that they've worked hard to create space where people could come together in recovery. And it's happening every week, Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock at our church. I think about a prayer that one couple in our church recently prayed where they said, as new tenants of a new apartment, their prayer when all the boxes were unloaded, like, okay, God, help us to use the resources and the location and the neighbors of this space who will come to bring glory to you and good to our city. How does God want to use the gifts you have to bring flourishing to our place and time? Three ways you could consider being growing in those things this week or taking some next steps. One, you could sign up to run, walk, or just support us in Araminta's race against traffic as we think about the role that the need for survivor work and healing work in the work of sex trafficking in Maryland and beyond. That's a great opportunity. Our links are in the comments or on the Foundry page. You can prayer walk your neighborhood or block every day this week, asking God to help you be attuned to the opportunities in front of you. Or maybe one other next step you could begin to take. We've got a free assessment we use with the Find Your Place class that you can go to, called the Gifts, Passion, Story Assessment. And if you go to our page, you can take that assessment, take the quiz, and when it emails you back your results, consider maybe sharing that with a follower of Jesus and asking them to pray with you about the opportunities ahead. Let's move to a time where we celebrate communion, where ultimately what we celebrate is not just that we are these warriors, these rescuers, these people of hope that are going to come and rescue the city and beyond from all of its ills. But that as followers of Jesus, that we have been transformed by God's presence and forgiveness. And that because God has transformed us, we want to be present. We want to be forgiving. We want to reflect the love of God shown to us. And as we partake today of bread and cup, I want to just invite you, as you partake, to reflect on these three questions. Write them down if you need to. Hit pause if you need to. But as you commune with God, as you receive communion today, ask yourself these things. Where has God placed you? What has God given you to share? And what has God equipped you to see that others don't? God, thank you for your willingness to sit with us, to be present with us, and to use our humble offerings to bring glory to you and to bring good and healing to the world. Lead, guide, and direct us in your Spirit. Amen.